is the Associate Director of the Andrew Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research and an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He received his PhD in 1991 from Boston University. He came to the University of Massachusetts, Boston in 2000 from Michigan Technological University, where he was an associate professor. During 1997 and 98, he was a research fellow in the Archaeobiology Laboratory of the Smithsonian Institution. His program tonight is Pits, Posts, and Palisades, the Archaeology of the 17th Century Plymouth Colony Settlement on Burial Hill, Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. And now I'm going to try and see if I can share my screen. And we'll go through a few little clicks to make sure you're seeing slides, and you're seeing like something way in the middle of this. Let me just try and get back to the beginning of this before I screen share this. Sorry about that. How's that? That look right to everyone?
Good to me.
You're seeing the slides. Good. All right. So thank you for inviting me tonight. And, you know, if that image I saw at the beginning actually exists as a physical patch, I would love as part of this exchange if I could get a physical patch, because that was a great patch there. So, and I kind of collect patches and put them on my pack. So I appreciate that. And I'm thank you for inviting me. Let me just start my, when my slides are up, my timer goes off. So I'm going to start my timer here too, so I can keep track of the time, because this is one of my favorite subjects that I'm talking about tonight. So I'm thrilled to be given this opportunity. I've been working for about the past decade now, close to a decade, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, kind of revisiting the archaeology of the Plymouth Colony, and a lot of it, it's by really strange kind of cosmic convergence of some kind. We were working on a lot of this in the lead up to the 2020 year, which was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. So 1620, 2020. And so we were expecting last year to really be an important year for our project as we were working towards that. You know, as you know, our kind of whole pandemic and COVID situation has changed a lot of that. But it's interesting because that loops back to this story too, because an epidemic went through the area where the Plymouth colonists, the Pilgrims, settled in 1620 in the years preceding their arrival, and kind of reduced the native population where they were. So it's kind of a strange kind of parallel in the story there. But I wanted to give you kind of an overview of our project, talk about some of the work that we've been doing, and then have a time also to answer any questions that you have. The project that we've been working on is very much a collaborative project. So we've been working with Plymouth Plantation, which is a living history museum in Massachusetts that tries to interpret the 17th century. So they actually have a reconstructed 17th century village that tries to recreate the original Pilgrim settlement. Plus, immediately adjacent to that, they have a Wampanoag home site that is interpreted by Native people to actually kind of talk about Native life during the time. And we've been working also a lot with the town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, which very much viewed our project kind of as they're a strong supporter of our project. We've been working a lot on town land in the towns of Plymouth. So this is, as I said, I've been working on this for almost a decade, and in practical terms, that means I've spent almost a year of my life actually digging in the town of Plymouth. So we've dug at a whole series of sites across the town, and we've kind of matched our excavation of sites there with going back to a lot of the old archaeological collections that existed from previous excavations to try and learn more new information about the Plymouth and Pilgrim settlement. And we've also been doing this very much as kind of a public archaeology project. So trying to really kind of have some significant outreach to interested people and descendants. And the town, part of the town's interest in this was they were very interested in the archaeology, because people get excited about the archaeology and it becomes part of their kind of heritage tourism. So the town of Plymouth is very much kind of a heritage tourism destination, and was interested in the project partially in that respect. One of the interesting aspects of this is that when we start delving in a very serious way into the history and archaeology of the Plymouth Colony and the Pilgrim Settlement, there are actually some kind of strongly, at times strongly conflicting views about this. And one of the things that's very interesting about the town is that despite the town being very interested in kind of the heritage tourism aspect of this, the town is very open to kind of presenting aspects of this history that are a little bit difficult or not our usual kind of Thanksgiving story. And one aspect of that, the picture of the monument I'm showing here, one aspect of that is some Native people have a very different interpretation of this history, and mark Thanksgiving in Plymouth with kind of a alternative version that they call the National Day of Mourning. So at the same time, the town of Plymouth is celebrating Thanksgiving and people are there for that. There are also people there who are commemorating this as a in a really different fashion. And it's interesting because the town is open to both of these and willing to present those aspects of the history as well. And it's trying to actually then do a scientific project where all of these people with very different competing views are kind of watching what you do and critiquing what you do, right? It makes it very much in the public eye. So we've been working to try and kind of negotiate with all of these communities and their different views of this as we've been going through this process. And one aspect of this is that, and this is actually something that's really going through archaeology in a very significant way right now, is archaeologists are very much kind of in the process of like rethinking their responsibilities to Native communities, who a lot of times archaeologists, that's our main focus of our archaeological excavation is excavating Indian sites. And archaeologists have really been trying to rethink, like, what is our kind of relationship with and responsibility in any way to the descendants who are still around of these Native communities. And so, one way that archaeologists recognize this now is by kind of recentering some of this when we're working on historic sites from kind of the Native vantage point. So southern New England was a complicated and busy place when the Pilgrims arrived. So despite sometimes our concept of them arriving kind of in a kind of open landscape, it was actually a very complicated landscape with lots of different competing Native communities in it. The other kind of trend in archaeology is to recognize the communities where we're speaking from. So I'm speaking to you from Boston, in the traditional homeland of the Massachusetts people. So, and the community that we're talking about in Plymouth was an area where the Wampanoag was an area of Wampanoag habitation. And at the time the Pilgrims arrived, the Wampanoag had been hit very hard by an epidemic along the coast. So the coastal area along southern Massachusetts had been really affected by a disease that had come through between 1616 and 1619. And a lot of the Wampanoag had retreated inland to the west and southwest. And part of the problem there for the Wampanoag was that the Narragansetts, who were further to the west in Rhode Island, were their traditional enemies. So the Narragansett and Wampanoag were in conflict with each other and struggling for kind of power and control in this area. And so when the English arrived and established a settled colony, part of the reason the Wampanoag were very open and welcoming to them is that they viewed the potential of the English as an alliance against the Narragansett at a time when they had been really weakened by the epidemic that had wiped out some of their communities. So it's an interesting and complex kind of native environment that the Pilgrims and the other colonists are arriving in at this time. And we've been trying in a systematic way for the last, as I mentioned, the last decade, to really go back and systematically research this through a series of archaeological field schools. So these are a couple of end of the season shots of our crew out at the edge of one of our sites where we've been working. And this has been a big project with lots of my colleagues. I can't take all the credit for this. So there have been lots of other people involved in this. I'm just giving a little, shout out to a few of the others here, my colleagues, and a lot of the students who worked with this over the years. I like to say that we travel with a very talented and merry band when we go on our excavation. So a lot of times we have a very kind of fun group that gets engaged in these projects. And the main area where we've been working is in a historic cemetery that's right in the center of downtown Plymouth, Massachusetts. And Plymouth, Massachusetts it's not really a big town. It's a small town, but it's definitely a town. So we're not out in the woods doing an archaeology project. We're in the downtown in a area that's really quite developed. And we've been working along the margins of a historic cemetery, which is one of the kind of major open areas that's still left in the downtown. And in the kind of image on the upper left here, I think you can see my pointer when I'm going, right? The site of the first fort, built in 1621, used as also used for a church. One of the questions people always ask archaeologists is like, how do you find where to dig? And I'm like, well, we go to the historic marker where it says the first fort was, right? If we can find that. But this is obviously not a place we could really dig, because as you can see, around this fort marker site are gravestone, 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 gravestone. So it's not really a place for an archaeological excavation. And in fact, when you kind of interrogate this historical marker, it's not even, really clear that it's necessarily accurate, because the first map that puts this on the ground is this map that I have a section of in the lower right. So it says site of the old fort, also used as a place of worship. It locates a point, a watchtower, site of an old fort, but the map is from the 1870s. The fort comes down in the 1670s. So it's 200 years later before this location is ever marked on a map. So there was always some questions about, the legitimacy of the maps. I would say that although we haven't dug around, the site of the first fort, we've been digging down in this area, and I would say that in a large way we have kind of confirmed this location on the hill. But there's still lots of questions about the general layout. the basic idea was that on top of this hill, they built a fort, and then the settlement stretched out down the hill towards the water, which is about half a mile away. And then in response to concerns about native hostility, they built very hastily a palisade around the entire settlement. So basically like a wooden stockade fence or stockade wall around the settlement, which kind of got rebuilt or fixed up periodically between 1621 and 1675 when it finally came down. And it finally came down, after essentially the last kind of organized native resistance against the English in southern New England, which is known as King Philip's War. Native people kind of joined together and tried to fight back against the English, and the English prevailed in that conflict, and it was shortly after that that they actually took down the fort and palisade, and then shortly after converted the whole area into a burial ground. So there's standing markers in this burial ground that go back to the 1680s. So shortly after the actual fort structure came down. The area we've been working is, in addition to digging in all kinds of other places around the town. So, we've been doing kind of an urban archaeology project. So we've been digging in lots of different locations, but our main success has been right at the margins of this burial ground. So next to a historic church and a series of, as I said, this is an 1870s map, a series of buildings that ran along School Street. These buildings are all gone now, torn down, but we've basically been working in the margin behind the buildings and before the graves start further up the hill. There's kind of a thin margin along the edge of this burial ground where we've been concentrating our work. And here's an aerial view of what that looks like today. So our church is off this, you can see just the edge of the church building here. There's still a church building standing. Our archaeological site is cut in half by an 1830s burial vault. So the town built a burial vault at the edge of the cemetery, and that burial vault cuts our archaeological site in half. You can see grave markers up here at the edge. So we're kind of, and this is not actually a grave marker, but another memorial on the edge of the hill. And School Street would be just off this image to the bottom here. And we've been working in this little margin, and this is kind of the nature of working in a downtown, where we're looking for little patches of areas that haven't been destroyed, where we can find intact remnants of the archaeological site. I've grayed out now the areas that have been disturbed or destroyed by the buildings along School Street, the construction of the 1830s burial crypt, and the cemetery. And you can see we've got very narrow areas where we've been doing our work, but within that, narrow area, we found the yard area outside of one or more houses. We found remnants of two buildings, the location of the palisade that encircled the settlement, and then part of a Wampanoag site area immediately outside of the palisade. One of the difficulties of the archaeology that we're doing is that for the time period that we're looking for, all of the buildings were built with what's called post and ground or earth-fast construction. Both native buildings and English buildings from this time period. So on the left is an example of an English building from the 17th century, and it's lifted the building up off the ground to see what the plan looks like. But the building was built by putting posts into the ground and then building walls between those posts. So the earliest buildings didn't have any stone foundation, no brick foundation, not even brick chimneys. not even really wooden sills in the very earliest buildings. They're literally just putting posts into the ground and building walls in between them. And when that building comes down and rots out, what's left is the soil stain from the posts. And native buildings, this one, the walls have not been put on yet. This is an example from the Living History Museum that I mentioned, where we're building a native weatu, which is the term here for one of these house structures. And you can see its posts in the ground as the base of this. So all of our buildings at the time end up looking, there's no foundation. You're looking for soil stains left from the posts. So here's what really exciting archaeology from the 17th century looks like, right? This is out in the yard area, and you can see there clearly are some differences in the color and composition and texture of the soils. But this is actually really great archaeology for the time period. And then when we interpret this is what we kind of come up with in terms of how we interpreted this excavation unit. So we've demarcated and interpreted areas of these different color soils, and we've got a post hole, what we identified as a planting hole, another post hole that's been cut off the top of it or truncated, a trench where part of the top was scraped off, and then some soil stains that we didn't identify. The one that we identified it as a shallow trench, I think we would now interpret it as actually a path next to the edge of a fence or a building. So a little pathway that went along with this post hole being either the edge of the building or an edge of a fence. And I'm going to talk some about what we found in a bunch of these areas, the pit with the calf burial and the planting hole in particular. But a lot of our time when we're digging ends up we spend up a lot of time trying to do subtle differences in the soil color and texture. So we're a lot of time spent on, is this one sandier or siltier than the next soil? And is it a little darker? Is it more organic? We spend a lot of time going through things like that. In all of this, we know that we're on the 17th century site because we have a great collection of period artifacts. And a lot of these are artifacts that only an archaeologist could love, because when you're looking at little broken bits of pottery, that is an acquired taste, I guess you would say. Some of these we can really recognize. I would now say this is either English or borderware or Dutch courseware. I've changed my mind already about what some of the pottery might be, but because some of it's not too well known from New England. Some of it's very well known, this German stoneware. There was a very distinctive German bottle that was made during this time period. Actually, I like to think that it was the original German beer bottle of the time period, but this is found everywhere on archaeological sites, very distinctive German stonewares, a whole variety of lead shot, beads, and straight pins. So we do have a good artifact assemblage that's very diagnostic from the time period. And as archaeologists, we spend an obsessive amount of time, cataloging every one of these sherds. I know I'm talking to a sympathetic audience. We count and weigh and sort every little bit, and that's how the wintertime is spent. One of the other things we've been doing some work on sampling parts of our sites in other ways that are kind of systematic to look at microscopic characteristics of the soil and sediment layers, or also to archive parts of the site. So this is my colleague Dennis Piota, and what he's doing is he's actually cutting out a block of soil from the side of one of our excavation units to preserve a section of the soil layers there. And what we do with these is we take them back to the lab after we've taken them out. He's using like plaster of Paris and bandages to essentially put like a cast around a section of this soil, we'll take it back to the lab and fill it with fiberglass resin, make a solid block out of it, and then it's possible to section it and make sections of this to look at the either sections of that to preserve part of the site forever as an archive, or to sub-select pieces to make into micromorphology sections and actually make slides for looking at the microstructure. And one of the features that we sampled like this was the one that I identified as a planting hole. And part of the reason we took a section of that, and this is showing the end result of that. So these are blown up views of a micrograph. So the field width is only 30 millimeters for this. It's a blow up of a micrograph. We saved and sectioned a part of this planting feature because as we were starting to excavate it, it seemed like it had a lot of small animal bones present in it, a lot of organic material in it. And one of the really kind of classic stories of the early time of the Plymouth colony is that Squanto teaches the Pilgrims to grow corn by putting herring in the corn hills. So we have a little feature that looks like a little pit. We look at, it's much more organic than the other areas. Maybe it's a planting hole. We start digging it and it's like, wow, that seems like there's a lot of organic material in here. It's like, we need to save a section of this and be able to take it back to the lab, especially if we're going to say that we found a planting hole with fish bones in it, because no one will believe us, but I have micrograph slides and a preserved section of that feature. So I can, this is actually under regular light, and then this is fluorescent light to show all of the areas that are looking very bright and light here are the small fish bones that are fluorescing under the light. So we also took soil samples of this to run through fine screens for flotation and pick the fish bones out. And in fact, we have head bones, predominantly head bones of herring that are in this small planting feature. So it's an interesting kind of scientific verification of one of the parts of the early Pilgrim story. So this is where we took that little planting feature out. Nearby it, we actually encountered a small pit with a series of animal bones in it. And this one ended up being a concentration of calf bones thrown together in a pit. We know that it's not a Wampanoag site feature because the Wampanoags did not have domestic cattle before the English arrived. So we know it's an English colonist animal bones. And it's unusual because most of the times when animals were eaten, they were cut up into small pieces and the bones ended up being dispersed across a lot of different areas rather than concentrated in single pits. And this one, you can see a lot of these bones are actually articulated. So parts of this calf were actually put together into this pit while the animal was still not fully chopped up and butchered and was partially articulated. So when we first discovered this was actually one of our kind of fun big discoveries. As you can imagine, the students who were with us loved this, and excavating this, a very unusual feature. We had a lot of speculation about why would this calf be buried and not be eaten? What happened? You know, what's the story kind of? And we made up a lot of great stories while we were excavating it out. Maybe the animal was sick, or it had been eaten by wolves, or something bad had transpired. The students named the calf Constance, and they had they had a very specific story about why Constance was the right name for this calf. And I went back to my university in the fall and I was like, you know, we found some great discoveries this summer, including this calf burial that was really interesting. And the woman said, tell me more about the calf. I said, well, it's actually Constance the calf. She's like, Constance the calf, Constance the calf. We're going to make that go viral. And I was like, I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds exciting. So that we got a lot of publicity because this was actually, the excavations in this area is one of the first times we really had some really kind of interesting and definitive evidence from the early settlement. So we ultimately took all of these bones out of this pit and back to the lab and kind of did our kind of forensic work over of this to try and determine, you know, what the story was here. And the illustrations here are showing what parts of the skeleton we recovered in black. And the red on this is where the butchery marks are on these bones. So we went over all of the surfaces of the bones looking for any kind of information about any pathology. So is there any sign the animal was sick? No, there's no pathologies. Any sign the animal was chewed up by wolves? Are there tooth marks on these bones? No tooth marks. What are the surface marks on the bones? Oh, the surface marks on the bones are predominantly butchery marks. And the butchery marks are quite widespread. There's cut marks on a lot of these bones. And on lots of different parts of the carcass. And by not a coincidence, the meatiest part of the animal, the hind leg, is missing. And so the animal wasn't actually complete in this burial. Parts of the animal had been removed before parts of it were put in the pit. And the nature of the cut marks suggests that the animal was actually kind of filleted. A lot of the meat was cut off before they took parts of the carcass still articulated and bury in the pit. So not a mystery story. Still a question of like why they would do this and not fully chop this animal up and put it into the soup pot. I like to think that maybe it was just getting towards the end of the summer. It was a little too hot. We didn't have the refrigerator, and we've kind of come to the end of this animal and filleted off the last of the meat before what's left has to go into a pit. One of the other things that we found in a lot of the areas in the yard is that every place we found pottery, all of the European pottery in the same soil layers, there was native pottery. So these have boring names on them because these are our archaeology names. So, you know, our feature A, feature B, but I've added, so the deep trench, the shallow trench, the calf burial. So in the calf burial, you know, there's more than 50 pieces of broken pottery, and it's mostly evenly split between English pottery and native pottery. And every place that across this site in this area, this pottery is co-occurring. And we went through there's a long kind of archaeological interpretation to determine whether these are mixed together from different sites or whether these are showing that this material was in use at the same time. But ultimately, we've come to the interpretation that this is showing the English pottery and the native pottery being used side by side within the English settlement in the earliest period. This is just some of the kind of, you know, evidence that we use, the co-occurrence, the size, comparison to other native pottery. And since we're working with the Living History Museum, this was actually an important thing for them. We say, you know, I think in the earliest village, they were actually using native pottery sometimes alongside English pottery in the earliest houses. So they actually tried this out and took some native pots into their reconstructed English houses and gave them a try and tried cooking with them, because that's what you do in a living history exhibit. And so they fired it up to give it a try. And they they shared a little video clip with me of some of their efforts. So this is one of the ways kind of our archaeological work is playing into the interpretation in the living history. And I just should say, this is from an archaeological perspective, this is important too, because a lot of times we think very easily about Indians adopting English technology, or implements, but don't necessarily think about what the exchange is going the other direction. And you know, a lot of it for the Plymouth Colony and the Pilgrims, a lot of it is actually food. So learning about corn, the herring, learning methods of fishing and things like that. But it shouldn't surprise us, I guess, if some of the corn actually came in an Indian pot, right? So you know, I think maybe that's what we just have the evidence of, that some of the food came in the native container. In the area behind the burial crypt, we've actually been digging, not in a yard area, but in an area where we've got a couple of the buildings and part of the palisade, and we've been, as you can see, we've been digging to keep this beautiful copper beach alive. So we've been digging around and saving roots over a certain size as we've been excavating to try and keep from damaging this beautiful copper beach that's right adjacent to our site. So this was an aerial view of what some of our excavation looked like. We've taken all of the people out, and I'll give you an overview of like what main things we found up here. Parts of 2 buildings, and one with a very deeply buried building where the walls appear to have fallen in. The walls were made of daub, which was kind of a clay-like material, and as the building came down, that daub wall kind of came down and covered the floor of the building. We found part of the palisade line, which gives us inside of the settlement and outside of the settlement. And outside of the settlement, we've definitely got evidence for a Wampanoag native area of the site immediately adjacent to the settlement. The discovery of part of the palisade was a big one for us, and this is how exciting it looks. The archaeology of this time period, right? This was constructed like the buildings, was a series of wooden posts in the ground. And when those wooden posts rot, what we have is dark stains left from those posts and a series of rocks that abutted this as a trench. So it's a very subtle thing to discern during the course of our digging. So we can identify this in part, though, because we recognize what these look like from other archaeological sites. Here's an example where we cut part of one of those post trenches. So we actually can see, we cut one of our post holes in half. We can see the rotted out bottom of one of the posts here in this dark soil stain from the palisade line. And we know what these look like from other sites, notably from Jamestown, where they did a really systematic job of defining some of the palisade lines. In Virginia, those palisade posts were dug into red clay as the base. In Plymouth, our burial hill is on top of a glacial came, so it's all sand and gravel. So our soil is not quite as distinctive as this, but this is one of those palisade lines where they've marked out these dark stains from wooden posts rotted in the ground. And here they've excavated them out to show the kind of ghost print of what this looks like after they've taken out the posts of part of this palisade line. And it's interesting because a lot of times we think of these as very substantial structures, but in fact, they actually are using pretty small trees for this. And if the tree gets too big, they actually split them in half to make 2 posts instead of 1. And, they're just putting these into the bottom of these into a trench. So it's a very expedient construction. And we were able to connect up parts of the Wampanoag site that's immediately adjacent to the Palisade. And it's interesting because we have evidence that it's actually contemporary. So one of our questions, and one of the archaeological questions a lot of times is, if you're finding native material and English material side by side, is it two different sites, or is it actually like part of the same time period? Or was this like a place where the Wampanoag were living and then the English came and settled on it? Or is it people who were there at the same time? And this really seems to be evidence of people who were there at the same time. And these are kind of very classic examples of our time period. A Lavana point and English border wear are both kind of really diagnostic for our time period. And the from an archaeological perspective, it's really helpful to us to know that these are contemporary with each other, because it helps us understand what native people are doing next to the English settlement at the time. Within the English settlement, we again have a cluster of 17th century artifacts that kind of give us help us with our time period. So more of our German brown stoneware, pieces of white clay pipes, green glazed Dutch or English borderware, lead shot again. So part of what we're finding is very kind of normal household trash. But within some of these buildings, we've also been finding things that are a little more kind of distinctive or diagnostic. This is one of our fun artifacts that kind of points to some of the other functions of these buildings and also gives us a date. So this is a lead cloth bale seal. So this is about the size of a quarter, and you can see that it's in two pieces and kind of hinged or crimped over. So this would be actually like crimped onto a bolt of trade cloth. So the seal on one side is basically like a county tax stamp, and the number on the other side is showing the size of the bolt of cloth. This is an English bale seal from the Charles I period, so it's very nicely dated to our early settlement period. So the cloth is long gone, but we have the bale seal to show us that bolt of cloth. And these bolts of trade cloth were a really common trade object in Northern Europe at this time. So in Holland and in Northern France and in England, the textile industry is making mass producing cloth, and they're making big bolts of this that go as trade items. And these bale seals are actually known very well from Iroquois sites across a lot of New York, because the Dutch used this cloth as trade for fur with the Iroquois. So that these are found very commonly on archaeological sites. We also have a nice English patent farthing, again gives us a nice date for our time period. So the kind of early part of the 17th century. And again, the bale seal is a trade item. The coin is more kind of commercial or trade related, pointing to those parts of the settlement. And one of our kind of unusual ones was one of the archaeology jokes is that you always find the best thing on the last day of the digging. Well, one year, our last day of digging, we uncovered a little piece of what we thought would be a shovel blade or a hoe or something in one of our excavation units. And we decided we would try and dig it out before we closed up for the year. And as we dug, we found that it was much larger than a shovel or a hoe. And it actually turned out to be a large sheet of iron. So this is actually in a very tightly dated pre-1650 context from the Plymouth settlement. And so this makes this actually very unusual because it's a piece of sheet metal that has been pounded out. So not rolled out, but pounded out like a blacksmith, a large scale piece of pounded out sheet iron, which we, in our best interpretation, view as a piece of sheet metal stock. So essentially something a foundry would make to ship to be used by a blacksmith. I would like that better if it had big pieces cut out of it, or I had some evidence of blacksmithing. We don't know why it was left in this building, but we believe it's a piece of sheet metal stock that was shipped over to the colony to be made into tools there by a blacksmith and just never got used and left in the building. So those kind of series of artifacts give some ideas about some of the commercial uses of these buildings. One of the interesting challenges of this is that our best building evidence is very deeply buried. So we've got of the floor of one of these buildings, which the building actually appears to have been cut into the hillside to construct it. And we dug down to the floor layer and found the kind of trash from the building and the people who were living in it spilled out into the floor layer. And some of that, again, is not so much our kind of commercial things, but more household things. But this one is a great example of a Dutch tin glazed plate. So a fancier plate that someone would have had in what is otherwise a very unpretentious building, right? Because we've actually got a building with a dirt floor that's been cut into the hillside. So we're probably looking at a very early building, but nonetheless has some of these kind of company type artifacts in it with this bar stock and the bale seal, but also signs that people were living in this building as well. One of the things that we do is since we know that we only are going to have a small preserved piece of this site in Plymouth, we're very careful about our sampling work. So we try and do our best to figure out every kind of piece of data that we can collect out of this limited archaeological site. And Anya, one of the graduate students who's been working with us, is a plant remains expert, and we've been systematically collecting soil samples to recover plant remains throughout our excavation. So when we got down to the floor of the building was covered with a layer of soot and charcoal from fires that were built on the floor of the building. So Anya was busily scraping soil into a bag to be able to recover burned seeds and pieces of charcoal from this burn layer at the base of the building. So why is Anya sampling? She's sampling for seeds. And why is she smiling? Because the soil's burned, so there might be seeds preserved there. So this is kind of part of the kind of systematic mode that we operate in. Ultimately, this is currently our best reconstruction of what we've found up in this section of Burial Hill. So we've got a section of the Palisade line with a Wampanoag area outside and parts of two buildings. We don't have all of these buildings yet, but two buildings on the inside. We know the most about this one that seems to be kind of cut into the hillside. It had at least one window in it because we found pieces of diamond pane window and came for it. There's no evidence of a chimney or any kind of foundation to it. And a building that was probably a combination of a company building with some more commercial aspects to it, but also was housing people. And the construction into the hillside is probably a representation of a building that's very early in the history of the colony, when they're using very simple construction methods to try and quickly construct buildings. In this case, kind of using part of the bank to form some of the walls of the building. And with that, I'll put up my thank you slide and be happy to answer any questions that anyone would like to pose.
I have a question, David. To whom do the artifacts belong at this point?
Should I stop my share and anyone have a preference?
No preference. It's okay
No
to
preference.
keep it up.
Okay,
You
I'll
can
leave
keep
up.
it up.
I'll leave my thank you one up. So in Massachusetts, when we're digging under state permit in Massachusetts, the state law says that the artifacts belong to the state of Massachusetts. But we're digging on town land, and we're digging, as one of our partners, a museum that's in the town. So I think the town would be upset if the state ever actually tried to claim ownership. I think the town would be upset. The town really likes the idea that the artifacts will come back and reside in the town. And a lot of the people who are followers of our project, we have a loyal following in the town, and that's one of their people's main questions, like, where are the artifacts going to go? Whose stuff is this? And it's like, it's coming back to the town, I promise, So our long-term plan is actually to make sure all of these materials, they're on loan for now at UMass Boston, but that all these materials end up back in the town of Plymouth at the Plymouth Patuxent Museum.
Will they be on display?
This was one of the sad things that got hit by the closures. We had a opening for a museum exhibit that literally the opening night was the day Massachusetts closed down. So they have a virtual exhibit of it up, but it's not quite the same thing, but there is some material on display already. And yes, in the longer run, we're hoping to be able to, share the results of this as much as possible with the public and put it on display.
I got a couple of questions. One is, do you think that the museum will be reopened sooner?
Yes, they've reopened on a limited basis already, and they're really hoping this summer is going to be fully open.
Yeah, and the Thanksgiving, you talk about their thing is different than the Thanksgiving we know and fought. It was different than we fought, or we know.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that people have really been trying to work on during this 400th anniversary, is reconsidering what the Thanksgiving might look like.
Yeah, it looked different than I remember.
And when we go back to the historical accounts, it definitely looks different, because a close reading of the historical accounts suggests that the Pilgrims were outnumbered by Native people about 5-1 at the first Thanksgiving. So it was mostly Indians. And it's not how we usually picture it. It's interesting. It's interesting to think through.
To take Andrew's question a little bit further, you are finding Native American artifacts there too, and sometimes state laws are, I don't know, in conflict or overlapping with Native American requirements. Did that have any effect on your sites?
So we've been working very closely with Wampanoag descendants. So Massachusetts, despite the widespread perception in Massachusetts that there aren't any Native people, there are still Native people in Massachusetts. There are federally recognized reservations in Massachusetts, and they're descendants of the Wampanoag. who are very vibrant communities. So we've been, and the Mashpee Wampanoag community that we've been working with most closely has a tribal historic preservation office. And we've been having members from the tribal historic preservation office come out and join our project for the last few years, and essentially using that as a training opportunity for people from the tribal historic preservation office to learn more about archaeology, participating in the archaeological field school. And I think that relationship has helped alleviate concerns about the native material that we're finding, and has gone a long way. So when we started this project, I mentioned that the fort came down at the end of King Philip's War. Well, one of the stories that is never associated with the Pilgrims is that on several occasions they decapitated native people and put their heads on pikes next to the fort. And one of those was King Philip, right at the very end of the King Philip's War in the 1670s. And shortly before the fort came down, the historical account is that they put the head of the kind of native leader of this rebellion on a spike outside of the fort. So that is part of the native, and their Wampanoag descendants who trace their ancestry to King Philip. So that's part of the Wampanoag view of the history of this place. So that was part of the discussion at the beginning of our project. Like, wow, we want to go looking for the early Pilgrim settlement. And, that was one of the kind of questions, was like, well, how is that going to be portrayed? And what version of that history are you going to tell? And I was like, we want to tell the whole version of that history. But as you can imagine, if some people are viewing it as in that light, there's complex things to negotiate through there. So
what was the time frame on this project?
the time frame in what sense?
Like when did it start? When was most of the dig? Was it 2019 or was it last year? Or
Oh, we started, we did our first dig in Plymouth in 2013.
okay.
And we weren't able to dig in the summer of 2020, but we've basically went every summer from 2013 to 2019. And the slides that I showed you were mostly our discoveries from 2017, 2018, and 2019.
How do you cover it up in the wintertime?
We have to fill it back in.
Oh, okay.
So since we're working at the edge of the cemetery, this is one of the challenges. We have to fill it back in at the end of each year.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, all of it.
I'm hearing echoes.
Do you find artifacts and the likes of that of the pre-Plymouth Europeans coming in, the Wampanoag or whatever, their artifacts from 1500s, 1200s or whatever?
Yeah. Every place we dig in Plymouth, we find native artifacts that predate the arrival of the English. So the oldest we found are probably about 7,000 years old. But lots of stuff everywhere.
Some of the concerns you were talking about, my daughter did field work over at by Groton and Mystic with the Pequods. And but this was over a decade ago. I don't know if they're still excavating there, but they had the permission of obviously of the tribal chiefs and Congress. And but they were finding the same idea that about what was happening to those Native American tribe.
Yeah, and the Pequot project is another one where, the archaeologists really worked for a long time to kind of build a much better relationship with the native community to try and, change the attitude that archaeologists were just there to, rip off their stuff, and really kind of make it a much more collaborative and interactive relationship with native communities. And yeah, the work that's gone on with the Pequot is definitely a great example of that.
Is that still ongoing?
Yes, to some extent, and they've most recently been working on retracing a series of battles between the Pequot and the English, when the English, what's known as the Pequot War,
Mhm.
in the 1630s, when the English go down and burn a Pequot village and massacre everybody. And they've been tracing out a whole series of sites related to the battles that occurred during that period of war in the 1630s.
Is that held? Is that UConn that's doing that? My daughter was at Cornell, and they didn't have an actual field camp, so she had to go and find one on her own. I don't know if it was the University of Connecticut that was doing that.
Yeah, that's UConn. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they had a
I have a
house right
question
there
about the
on
cat.
site where they were staying. So they didn't have to, they were staying there on site, and they would just walk to to the excavations every day.
I looked some at information about your club before I came to the meeting tonight, and I'm guessing there are a lot of people who love field work in your group. So that's part of the fun of archaeology, is getting a group of people, and for our students, when we get to do this as a summer class, I think that's always one of the highlights. The notion that we oftentimes end up staying together as a group somewhere near our site and working every day, and doesn't matter if it's raining and outdoors and finding stuff. It's an interesting and fun experience.
Advances are made in the field.
Yeah.
I
David,
have
I
a
have
question about the calf. The
Please.
Constance the calf.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Yeah, a question about Constance the calf.
Sure.
Have the remains ever been tested for leptospirosis?
No,
But I mean, you know why I'm asking.
I know I don't.
Oh, one of the suspicions for the disease that wiped out the Wampanoag is leptospirosis. The symptoms match leptospirosis better than they match smallpox, which is the disease that had previously been theorized to have wiped them out.
And cattle got this too?
Well, any animal can get it.
Any animal
It
can
comes
get it?
from, yeah, it's actually comes from rats, from rat urine.
Okay.
And the theory being that when Squanto and the others were kidnapped by Mr. Hunt, that rats came off of the ship and infected the area, and anyone who came in contact with the water, with the streams, would have been infected with leptospirosis.
This is one of the debates that I've kind of steered myself clear of, in a certain sense, like the kind of source or cause of the epidemic that went through the area. But I'm intrigued though. Yes. I don't have any good answer for you, because I have steered clear of this, but I appreciate the suggestion.
Are you considering digging outside the Palisades?
Yeah, this is actually this is actually kind of important to us in some ways because you know, we do want to try and understand the way, you know, sometimes something like a palisade actually is a defensive feature, and sometimes it's actually more of like a fence that kind of conceptually divides up the space more than being actually anything that really would be a functioning defensive feature. So if we think about it like that, then the question becomes like, how is this actually dividing up the space, and what kind of activities are going on inside and outside, and how are those different from each other? So that makes digging outside very interesting and important in the sense of like, we really want to kind of contrast, if we can, like what's going on immediately outside the settlement to what's going on inside the settlement. Are there the same artifacts outside, or is there like a division? Does this wall make a division that actually separated the use of space inside and outside in a significant way? And it really seems like so far that we would make the case that it really does divide up the activity and the way that space is used. But we have more to learn about that.
David, when you're digging and find post holes and what is essentially the foundation, the dirt foundation of these structures, do you ever go beneath those as if to determine there was a settlement prior to this one because it's on a hill, maybe strategic or dry, or some other environmental advantage?
Yeah, this is one of our huge questions that we spend a lot of time on that question, because if we're finding Wampanoag Indian artifacts and English artifacts, can we tell whether the English just built on top of a Wampanoag site, or are these Wampanoag artifacts from the same time period as when the English were there? So it's really important to us to understand, like, is there something beneath this structure that would suggest that there was in fact a Wampanoag site that predates the English settlement here? And are these artifacts mixed together because the English were disturbing an earlier Wampanoag site, or are there native pottery here because the corn was coming in native pots into the settlement? Those are two very different things that we would want to try, that we are trying to kind of differentiate. So this is one of our favorite games while we're digging.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, throughout history, peoples have built structures on top of structures for thousands of years, and they usually choose the sites for similar reasons, right?
Yes, right. So this
So it
is
would almost beg to, you'd almost imagine that there would be a settlement. If there were people in the area, there might be a settlement underneath the one of the early 1600s.
Right. So this becomes one of the big challenges. It's like differentiating parts of Indian sites that are earlier and parts that are contemporary, and trying to determine if there's any kind of essentially time sequence to these sites. Some sites, it's obvious that there is, and it's clear that the English in some areas just built on top of native sites for the same reason, because it's the high spot next to the river, and the kind of geographic and geological circumstances of it are just right. Where we're working on Burial Hill, we've got a little bit of evidence of both. We definitely have some parts that we would imagine are earlier Wampanoag settlement on parts of Burial Hill, but also within the settlement itself, our sense is really that the native artifacts that we're finding are there because they're contemporary with the settlement and not just kind of a disturbed earlier site. Great questions, everybody. You're making me answer here. You know, this is yeah, this is real.
I'm guessing you've done radiocarbon, but I would guess that the resolution wouldn't be good enough to determine if they were contemporaneous or not.
Yeah, we when we have samples that are appropriate, you know, we do radiocarbon date stuff. It's kind of falls apart a little bit in our exact time period in terms of its you know, utility. And then once we have European artifacts, our ability to date those European artifacts is usually so much stronger. So, you know, obviously something like, you know, the bale seal or the coin, where we're, you know, down to, you know, a 40-year period or something when it was in use. But we play those against each other a lot. And we rule out sometimes, like, oh, something is definitely earlier based on a radiocarbon date.
David, my favorite discovery that you presented in your talk were the herring head bones with the corn in the planting hole. Is there evidence in Europe that fish was used as fertilizer in agriculture, or is this a Native American invention?
Yeah, that's one of the other ones that's debated, is, you know, how much is that actually you know, is that really a native tradition that native people did, or is that something that, like, is it possible even, you know, Squanto who went to Europe picked up there and brought back, or was this indigenous? And there is another site on Cape Cod that's been found that's similar to this time period, or maybe marginally earlier, that's a native site where they recovered some corn hills that also had fish bones in them. So that there does seem to be supporting archaeological evidence that this was a native practice. But there's still, you know, the native people in this region accept it as a native practice and don't have any question that it's a native practice. I don't think there's good evidence to think otherwise.
If you dug several meters below your current site and found a Native American planting hole with fish bones, then that would answer the question, wouldn't it?
That would potentially answer our question, right? If we
How deep are you allowed to go? I know you can't go toward the cemetery or toward School Street, but can you drill into the earth?
Yes, and we, every time we dig to the bottom. So you know, and around here, that's a lot easier to find than in parts of the Midwest, because the entire area where we're working is a glacial outwash. So the basal sediments are all glacial sand and gravels. And so it's really easy to tell when you're in geology and not archaeology anymore, because it's just sterile sand. And so that we recognize that essentially is like, there's no more native sites going to be here, because now we're down to the glacial outwash event. And so we kind of use that as our marker of the quote bottom of our excavation units. And so far, yeah, no, nothing that we would, I like the way you're thinking, but yeah, so far, no luck with that.
I know there's a lot of exposed bedrock in the New York area. Do you find that in Massachusetts as well?
Not so much. There's some, but not much in the area where where we're working.
Because you're more coastal, because it's more
We're more
coastal.
coastal, and we're right near where Cape Cod goes out.
Yep.
And all of Cape Cod is a giant glacial push-up of sand and gravels. And Burial Hill itself is a little glacial came. It's a little kind of hill that's just a big drop of glacial sand and gravels. So a pretty consistent kind of sandy subsoil or sandy subsediment here.
Thank you.
Why were they using charcoal powder for their flooring in the dirt floor hut? I would think that would be dirty.
I'm not sure that the charcoal was intentional or just the byproduct of having an open fire at the edge of the inside. So we haven't dug out the whole building. We've only dug out part of the building, but the part that we've dug out so far, there's no indication there was kind of like an organized fireplace. So no like brick fireplace or anything like that. And it's in our sense is, and it would be right for the time period, that they would have just had a fire in the floor with a hole in the roof. And I think the charcoal is just the end result of like lots of fires right in the floor of the building, and over time getting spread out and accumulated.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you have dating for these kinds of post foundations. Like, is there some other like written records about when people start using stone or shifting to more permanent foundations?
So this is a this one, we can partially answer this archaeologically because when do we start actually finding kind of stone foundations on buildings? And sometimes it wasn't long after this period when people started making like partial foundations out of stone. So they'd make like a little storage cellar under one part of the house and line the cellar with stone, but then have posts in the ground for the rest of the building. And it seems like people continued to sometimes build like sheds and outbuildings into the 19th century, just putting posts in the ground. So it's kind of, I guess it varied. Certainly, the building construction got better and they started using sills and started kind of building more real foundations. But that's probably more like 1700.
But are these like predominance of the post foundations? Is that part of your evidence for knowing that this is quite early, quite early in the settlement? I mean,
yes, and it took archaeologists a while to recognize that this was the remains of buildings. So at first people didn't necessarily recognize that you could, try and figure out the pattern of the building by finding the posts. And then once people did, and this was, in the kind of like 1970s and 1980s, then people started finding these buildings a lot. And it's much better known in the Chesapeake. And in the Chesapeake, they're really developed this a well-established tradition of building with just posts straight into the ground. And in part, that seemed to continue for a while because it was a fast and cheap construction method. And so if you wanted to put more labor into other things, it was a quick and effective means of building a building. So, you know, it makes it hard for the archaeologists though.
Do you have a lot of false identification of those pits? I mean, they seemed in the pictures quite striking, but not so much, or?
It's one of the things we do is we spend a lot of time standing around, like looking at the dirt and like, does that look round to you? That little brown spot over there? And we'll go scratch a little line about it and say, yeah, that's a little darker. Let's feel that. Is that siltier than the rest? And we spend a lot of time kind of scratching our heads and trying to make a pattern out of pretty subtle differences in the soil color, to try and kind of sort this out and map it out as we go. So it becomes a real subtle interpretation process a lot of times. Yeah.
Got it.
When I was a teenager, I buried a calf on our property. The vet told us that it died of buckeye poisoning, and her name was Farah.
So someday, you know, you've left a gift for future archaeologists right there. You probably didn't think about that at the time, but
No.
a gift for the future archaeologists.
Do you have any other places that you can look at to dig in the future?
So this has been one of our challenges all along, is, you know, since we're in the downtown, you know, we're right next to a big church and there's paved roads and it's all built up, and we've been kind of systematically doing tests at all different places around the town. And then ultimately coming back and working more on Burial Hill. So we've tested probably, you know, I didn't include a map of all of our test sites. We've tested at least, you know, 10 other locations within the downtown, but it's kind of it's kind of the challenge of finding preserved areas that haven't been so changed through time, that something can be preserved there. And it looks like a small town, but even a small town, you'd be surprised at how much people change the landscape over time by moving soil around and filling areas in, and you know, digging a new channel for the creek, or drying areas out, and just the process of changing the landscape is really, when you start looking at it archaeologically, it's really dramatic, what people do to change the landscape. So finding parts of the early settlement preserved in the downtown has been our major challenge. I like to say that if we're looking at a jigsaw puzzle, so far we found one piece, right? If the whole settlement is our jigsaw puzzle, we found one piece, but it's an edge piece because we got part of the Palisade. It's an edge piece of the puzzle, right? So, you know, it's kind of like that. We're never going to get the whole map of it, because unlike Jamestown, where they moved to another location and the town didn't like grow up on top of the settlement, here the town stayed in the same place, and, you know, 400 years later, the town still is in the same place. So we've found one piece of the puzzle, but we're not going to get the whole puzzle.
Any other questions? Well, Dave, I'd like to thank you very much for the presentation. It's quite intriguing.
Very good.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
There he is.
I'm going to discontinue recording.